Hello, and welcome to episode 19 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to advance the public interest. Today, we're here with Evan Greenstein, who is an attorney for an affiliate of the AFL-CIO. Welcome, Evan, and please tell us your title.
My name is Evan Greenstein, and I'm a legal rights attorney for the American Federation of Government Employees, which represents some D.C. municipal employees, as well as many federal employees, though not all, and it's an affiliate of the AFL.
So, Evan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, I'd like to start off this conversation by asking you, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, I've been active in the Democratic Party for a very, very long time. I can recall going door to door for Clinton Gore in 1992. That was sort of my first exposure to politics. And I've been pretty active, mostly in the New Jersey Democratic Party. And then when I was at Vassar, where I know you went, Jordan, I was active with the Young Democrats there. My mom is also in politics. She is a state senator in New Jersey. And she ran for Congress several years ago in 2014. So politics in some ways is a family business for us.
So, so you've kind of got an early start in politics because of your mother's interest in it.
Well, I always say that I was interested in politics prior to my mom being into it. But I'm sure her influences and the influences of my dad got me into it as well.
So talk to me a little bit more about those influences. What really initially inspired you to get involved in politics, and what was it that your mother or father did that got them involved?
I don't know. My parents were always the type of people who watched the news a lot and always kept me informed. Mm-hmm. So I can, remember being up, waking up the morning of Election Day 1984, the day after Election Day, and asking my dad if Walter Mondale had won the election. And of course, we all know he had not won the election in by fairly landslide proportions. So I don't remember exactly what got me involved, but I mean, certainly public service, I think, probably extends from Judaism. I know you're Jewish, and there's the idea of Tikkun Olam, which means that we want to heal the world. So I think that there's kind of a long history of Jews being either involved in politics directly or being involved in social justice issues, and I have a very strong Jewish background. I went to Solomon Schechter, I went to Camp Ramah, I was in USY, so Jewish issues have always been, issues of Israel have always been near and dear to my heart. I would also say that my grandfather was in a union. He was a longtime clerk in a grocery store. I think he was a fruit guy. I don't know exactly what job he had, but he was in the predecessor to the UFCW, which is the Union of Food and Commercial Workers. I don't know what their predecessor union was, and I can remember a story that said when my grandfather joined the union, my grandparents were able to get into a bigger apartment. So, I've always had a real soft spot, in my heart for unions, and when I was able to get a job with a union, it was kind of a natural extension of my interests.
Interesting. So often individuals may you may attribute, it is known that labor unions contributed to the 8-hour workday and the creation of weekends. There's also a sense of fairness and giving a better shake for those, for employees generally. Does that resonate at all with what your experience is with labor unions and what you try to do through your job?
Right. Well, of course, the type of labor unions the labor union that I represent, I work in the General Counsel's office, is a federal public sector. So we represent only public sector employees. As I said before, also some in the D.C. municipal area. And of course, public sector unions have been on the attack. You're probably familiar with what happened in Wisconsin with Scott Walker, the Republican governor that was elected there in 2010, who basically stripped many state employees of collective bargaining rights, teachers and things like that. And really, when you strip union workers of collective bargaining rights, you're effectively going after the middle class. I mean, it really is class warfare. And I know sometimes that unions get a bad name, and it's really not fair. I always say to people, even some of my progressive friends who say liberal, who are liberal on just about everything else, but will then say something negative about unions, I say, I don't understand. I mean, unions really built the middle class, And I always tell people, well, if you don't like a union, you may not have one, and why don't you create one? Because of course unions help to the playing field in any workplace environment, whether it's the private sector, the public sector, is always going to be weighted in favor of management. So what unions are able to do is they help to level the playing field a little bit. Of course, there's never going to be a level playing field, but they do help to level it somewhat and give workers some kind of rights to ensure that they're not being taken advantage of.
So you spoke about Tikkun Olam and repairing the world, and you have these philosophical traditions in Judaism that are informing what you've done, and that, you said, helped lead you into, after law school, choosing to go into labor and advancing to public interest as opposed to a more well-remunerated position in a corporate law firm. Is that kind of the path that you took?
Definitely. I mean, it never really crossed my mind when I entered law school that I would go into any kind of corporate law. I mean, I figured I would become a prosecutor, which I did briefly in the city of Camden. Actually, it's Camden County. City of Camden is located within it. Or I figured I might be a public defender, or work in a union, in some capacity, work in politics.
And how has it, I mean, what was your, why did you choose to potentially go into a union? Why was that?
Well, as I said, I've always had strong feelings about unions. I mean, I've always been pro union. It's it would never cross my mind to not be pro union. Even my dad was actually a manager with Lucent, which was a spinoff of Bell Laboratories a long time ago. And sometimes he would I would see him go to, I wouldn't say war, but let's say battle with some of the locals that were in his the factory that he helped run. But what was great about my dad is he never really had a bad thing to say about unions. I mean, he was one of those managers who really said that he thinks that unions are there to level the playing field. So that was kind of, I think too often we hear managers say negative things about unions, but here was a manager, here was my dad, who was actually saying good things about the union.
So do you have any examples of that, I mean, that you could share with us about the work you do within the union that you think helps champion the cause of those who've been wronged, and where you're able to help level the playing fields, as you say, and make it more fair?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that I can't mention names, and I don't think I can go too much into the details of cases, but I have definitely seen, some people have questioned the need of public employees to unionize, but I've definitely seen some cases where people have really been treated wrongly. One agency that sticks out in my mind is the Department of Defense. I think that a lot of times, well, usually the high-level managers in the Department of Defense are military, and then of course you have civilian employees that work under them. And a lot of these managers who are military, they have no ability or comprehension of what unions are, because of course the culture in the military is to basically just do whatever, your supervisor tells you to walk off a bridge, you better walk off that bridge or you're going to probably be court-martialed for something. And a lot of these, I found that a lot of these managers, at least the military managers in the Department of Defense, don't really understand how to interface with unions. And I think sometimes as we win cases, we sort of put these people in their place, if you will.
So how does that make you feel?
Oh, it makes me feel great. I mean, every time I can, in the work that I do, I help to get federal employees their jobs back if they get fired. The idea is federal workers, often like teachers in most states, I know in Maryland and New Jersey certainly, they're tenured. And tenure sometimes gets a bad rap, but all tenure really is due process. It's just saying, yeah, you can fire someone, but you better have just cause, and you better have some kind of paper record to ensure that you can uphold this firing, usually before a third party, and those are the kind of the arbitrations that I do. And the best phone call that you can make is when you've had a federal employee or any employee who you feel has been wronged, and then you're able to get their job back. That is, the best phone call you can make. Hey, I was able to get your job back. And of course, the worst phone call you have to make is when you have to tell someone that you lost the arbitration and the termination has been upheld. But I also do sort of the more contractual, probably less exciting cases. Certainly the termination cases are the most exciting, because sometimes the fact patterns are interesting, to say the least. But I also do overtime grievances and fair labor, which of course is part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Seniority is not being respected, things like that. So we keep the federal government honest by holding them to the contract that they've signed with that particular local.
And, all right, so let's go back a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about the Tikkun Olam idea, the idea of repairing the world. So can you tell me a little bit more about what within Judaism and your Jewish identity has motivated you to pursue the work that you've done?
Well, certainly, as you know, being Jewish, tzedakah, which means charity, for lack of a better translation to English, is one of the big parts of Judaism. And what's interesting, of course, you may know that the root of the word tzedakah, tzadik, means justice in Hebrew. So the idea is that in Judaism, not only is being charitable an idea of just trying to be nice to people who are less fortunate, but it's an aspect of justice. And of course, justice is one of those essential things that we hold out as something that we absolutely need in society. So it's not just being nice to people and ensuring that people have shelter or food. It's also about actually creating justice. So that always resonated with me. So that's why I always felt I had a place kind of in liberal, progressive politics. And of course, a natural extension of that was being part of and working for a union.
So when you're in the legal system, you're actually advancing the cause of justice.
Well, sure, absolutely.
So you represent government employees having been hired to staff agencies that have been created by essentially elected officials.
Sure.
Your mother being one elected official. What is it like to be the son of a state senator from New Jersey who helps, I guess there's some Republicans on one side say that they'd like a smaller government. It doesn't always pan out under Republican leadership, and Democrats generally the idea is that like more of a government. And I guess what is it like to be both the son of a Democratic state senator who tries to who potentially favors a larger government, and then kind of on the other end of that spectrum, you're also now seeing individuals who've been hired to be part of that larger government, and you're trying to help protect their job. I guess is there any insight or perspective you have having knocked the doors and seen how the government actually works and how?
Sure, absolutely, and I think that's a good question. One of the things that I always do, certainly the main thing that we're tasked with doing is using the legal system, using the tools that are available to us under the collective bargaining agreements, usually either filing an unfair labor practice with the Federal Labor Relations Authority, which is kind of like the public sector analog to the NLRB, which most people are familiar with, the National Labor Relations Board, or filing a grievance, which you could then take to arbitration. But I often also will, if I'm having trouble dealing with an agency, I'll also go to, I try to use the political system to my client's advantage. And that doesn't mean, I don't want people to get the feeling that I'm somehow using the connections that I get from my mom to try to get things for people. It's just that because I'm very familiar with politics, I often know, having worked, my first political job was I interned for New Jersey Senator Lautenberg, I remember, in the summer of 1994, and a large part of that was learning how to navigate the bureaucracy. And I often will go to public officials because I really think that public officials can help you sometimes get information, or sometimes do help you get things done. Because these government managers, who were often called government bureaucrats, but I don't like using that word because I think it has a negative connotation. But when they wrong our employees, and I'm able to go to an elected official, and those elected officials then, or their offices or their staff, contact these managers, you always get the manager's attention. You certainly don't always get what you want or what you need, but you get some kind of answer, which I think that but for calling the senator's office or the congressman's office, you may not have gotten otherwise.
So talk to me a little bit about the idea of what justice is, and what fairness is, and what is public service. you obviously have your mother who is a elected official who, and that's one form of public service, but then you're representing a labor union. That's another form of public service. How would you define public service as a concept, as inclusive or exclusive as it may be in your mind? How would you define public service?
Well, I think it's, putting the public interest first, whether you're doing it as a politician or whether you're doing it as a lawyer for a union or whether you're doing it as a lobbyist for a client. Obviously, there are some folks who work in the private sector that go door to door for candidates or initiatives that they believe in. And certainly that's part of public service too. I mean, I think it's part of educating people. I mean, just the other day, I was going door to door in Virginia, and we were going door to door for two reasons. Of course, the presidential race. I don't know. Somebody may be listening to this in 20 years, and you'll probably research in history books about this presidential race that we're being subjected to in 2016. There's also a public question on the ballot in Virginia that would enshrine the so-called the Orwellian right to work laws that exist in Virginia and exist in many southern states. And it would enshrine that in the Virginia state constitution. So I recall just 2 weeks ago going to a woman's door, and of course I started to talk about Hillary, and she told me she was absolutely with Trump. And of course at that point these two candidates are so well known, it's unlikely that you're going to convince a Hillary voter to vote for Trump or a Trump voter to vote for Hillary. But then she was unfamiliar, as most voters are, with this public question, and she did tell me she was very pro-union, and I think, of course, haven't seen her ballot, but I think I was able to successfully get her to vote against question 1. So I think that part of public service is also reaching out to people. I mean, certainly we tend to think of Democrats as pro-union, and we tend to think of Republicans as anti-union, but I think that that's certainly a simplistic way of doing it. I think that there are Trump voters out there, and there are many conservative Republican voters out there who are going to be inclined to support union positions. Maybe not as many as Democrats, but I think it's important that we get those people out to vote, even though they're not going to vote for, quote, the candidate that we want for president.
So you're able to go out there and gain different perspective, both from working different political dynamics, working with elected officials to help make sure that constituent services are performed well for individuals who have some kind of need, who happen to be federal employees. But then you're also able to get your boots on the ground and talk to actual voters. Does that give you different perspective on the job?
Definitely. Well, talking to the actual voters always gives me perspective. The people who I'm working for, I'm not representing corporate clients. I'm representing, federal government workers who are by and large middle class people who work hard and have families and mortgages and everything else that the rest of middle class people have to worry about. And of course they're all over the country, so I get to travel a lot, and it's always neat to be able to kind of go to other parts of the country. Certainly I sort of live in this northeastern bubble. I was born in Kentucky, of all places. I always tell people that I was born in the same city as Justice Brandeis, so I have quite a legacy to live up to. If I could do 1/8 of what Justice Brandeis did in his life, I think I could say I lived a successful life, probably 1/20th. But I've spent most of my life in the Northeast, and it's always good to be able to get out of the Northeast and meet people in other parts of the country and get different perspectives.
And what kind of perspectives do they offer?
Well, I'm always sometimes I'm shocked at the people I meet are Republicans, and I, as this sort of Northeastern liberal, think to myself, well, I don't understand how a union worker, a federal government worker, could be a Republican. But they'll give me a different perspective on things, and I think it's important to get that, because I think sometimes in the Northeast we tend, especially in a state like Maryland or New Jersey, we tend to live in a liberal bubble. And I think it's important to get out and hear what other people are saying.
What's an example of what a Republican union member might give as their rationale for supporting policies that essentially destabilizes and undercuts a union?
Well, I think the cultural issues, particularly, thankfully, I think we've gotten over a lot of the gay discrimination that we were often dealing with. Certainly not just in the red states, but in the blue states too. I certainly never hear any anti-gay things when I travel from people, which is good. But I think that, one issue are guns. Sometimes I go to rural states. I've been to Alaska, and, people feel like they have to vote Republican in order to make sure that they can keep their guns. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's a good argument. I don't think that most Democrats, except maybe the most liberal of the most liberal, are trying to take guns from people. But listen, people that I always say there's three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. So I'm certainly not going to denigrate somebody else's opinion.
So sometimes individuals have many different identities, many different priorities, and many different values about many different issues,
Right.
and they may choose to, in one sense, be a single issue voter where they prioritize one issue above all other issues and find that they would support the individual who aligns with them on that one particular issue, even if that means that they're voting against their own self-interest on an array of other issues.
Sure. And I think that sometimes people do vote against their economic self-interest, and I think that that's a challenge that Democrats have been having at least for the last, probably 40 or 50 years. And I think it's up to the Democratic Party, I think, to try to articulate why it's important to vote for them.
So we're reaching the end of our podcast, and I'd like to ask you just to reflect for a moment about your career, having gone both through the political trenches and helped support Democratic Party in Maryland. You're still helping a little bit in in New Jersey and Virginia, and then on your actual chosen career path. I guess if you could leave our listeners with some reason as to your motivation, what really drives you day in and day out, especially as you see some of your former classmates from law school earning more money than you in salary. What do you tell yourself every day that helps you going forward to say this is a meaningful life, this is a life that is dedicated to public service, I'm advancing the public interest? What is it that really gets you going?
Well, I like people-oriented law. I mean, I think that when you represent corporations, maybe sometimes you lose sight of people because you're dealing with corporations as an entity, even though, as Mitt Romney said, corporations are people, but ultimately they're institutions. But with my job, I actually get to deal with real people, and I get to deal with, actual problems. I mean, I had a client, I was able to get her job back, and her daughter made me a kind of a thank you note on a piece of construction paper that said Evan the Great, and I of course have that up in my office, and that was just a very sweet and touching. I mean, I couldn't think of any better honor that I could have received. Obviously, I don't accept gifts, but I will make an exception for an art project that was done by a 10-year-old. But I mean, really, that kind of gift means more to me than any kind of gift certificate, which I would never accept. But
right.
It would mean more to me than that.
Okay, well, that has been episode 19 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. And you've heard it straight from Evan. Really, public service is a lifelong process. It takes many twists and turns, can manifest itself in electoral politics, through labor practices, but first and foremost, it's about the advancement of justice, advocacy for fairness, and making sure that everyone gets a good, fair shake in whatever deal they're a part of. So, Evan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Podcast listeners, will be with you next time on Public Interest Podcasts. Thank you.